In late 2024, Mexico shocked Detroit and Toronto by abruptly halting the flow of cheap Chinese electric vehicles. For years, the US and Canada had built tariff walls to keep out Chinese cars, but Mexico was the back door, until now. Mexico's sudden policy reversal upended assumptions about its economic allegiances and role in the North American trade bloc. By raising tariffs on Chinese vehicles and cutting tax breaks for non-partner countries, Mexico signaled it would no longer be a conduit for Chinese expansion. The move was met with both relief and anxiety in the US and Canada, raising questions about supply chains and the future of the trade agreement. North American automakers, who had watched Chinese brands gain ground in Mexico, saw the competitive landscape change overnight. Chinese companies' plans to use Mexico as a launchpad for the continent were thrown into disarray. For Washington and Ottawa, Mexico's assertiveness was a surprise. This was no longer just about policy, but about Mexico charting its own course. The consequences would ripple through every corner of the North American auto industry. Washington and Ottawa's anxiety over Chinese EVs had been mounting for years. Fearing unfair competition, the US and Canada imposed steep tariffs, but Chinese firms found a workaround: Mexico. Chinese companies began routing parts and investing in Mexican factories, aiming to qualify their vehicles as North American and bypass tariffs. Between 2018 and 2024, Mexico's imports of Chinese auto parts surged by over 90%, embedding Chinese content deep in the supply chain. Brands like BYD and SAIC's MG captured nearly 10% of Mexico's new car market, alarming US and Canadian automakers and unions. Labor groups warned that Chinese-owned factories in Mexico threatened jobs in Michigan and Ontario. The mounting pressure set the stage for a major confrontation over the future of North American trade. Mexico's rise as an automotive powerhouse made it a magnet for global carmakers, and increasingly, for Chinese investment. As the world shifted to electric vehicles, Chinese firms saw Mexico as a strategic gateway into North America. In 2023, Chinese investment in Mexico soared to nearly $3.8 billion, spanning assembly plants, batteries, and components. This influx fueled an economic boom. Mexico's EV production grew 30-fold between 2020 and 2024, with over 200,000 EVs produced in 2024 alone. Chinese brands quickly became bestsellers and local governments welcomed the investment, but nearly 80% of Mexico's EVs were exported to the US, raising alarms in Washington about a Trojan horse for Chinese ambitions. While Chinese FDI was still a small share overall, its concentration in autos set the stage for a high-stakes trade showdown. Mexico's success, powered by Chinese capital, was now a source of both pride and peril. The US, Canada, and Mexico built a web of tariffs to shield their auto industries from China. The US led with a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, effectively banning them and giving domestic producers breathing room. Canada followed suit, sealing the northern border and imposing a 25% surtax on Chinese steel and aluminum. Mexico, however, kept its doors open, offering incentives for EV imports regardless of origin, an open invitation for Chinese firms. This divergence created tension within the trade bloc, as US and Canadian officials argued Mexico's leniency undermined their efforts. The fear cars assembled in Mexico with Chinese parts would flow freely north, circumventing tariffs. Intense diplomatic pressure mounted on Mexico to align its policies with its partners. The stage was set for Mexico's dramatic policy shift. Autumn 2024 marked a decisive shift in North American trade. Under pressure from Washington and facing Chinese dominance at home, Mexico pivoted sharply. It raised tariffs on Chinese cars to 50% and eliminated EV incentives for non-partner countries, targeting China directly. This move instantly made Chinese EVs more expensive and leveled the playing field for domestic and partner automakers. Mexico also aligned with the US on tariffs for steel and aluminum, closing loopholes for Chinese transshipment. The reasons were clear: US pressure ahead of the 2026 USMCA review and a need to protect Mexico's own auto industry from being overwhelmed. Chinese EVs had captured nearly 10% of Mexico's market in record time. Without action, Mexico risked losing its chance to develop a domestic industry, not just serve as an assembly hub. The surprise wasn't that Mexico acted, but how decisively it realigned the continent's trade dynamic. The new policy targeted both finished vehicles and raw materials, signaling a comprehensive approach. Mexico's move was both a concession and a declaration of independence in the trade war. The entire North American auto landscape was transformed in weeks. Mexico's tariff changes sent shockwaves through the North American auto industry. For Detroit and Canadian automakers, it was a hard-won victory. Chinese EVs assembled in Mexico would no longer undercut them. Chinese automakers who had invested heavily in Mexico saw their strategies unravel as tariffs and lost incentives made their cars less competitive. US and Canadian auto unions celebrated, seeing the move as protection for domestic jobs. For nearly 1 million Mexican auto workers, the future became uncertain. The policy protected them from Chinese imports, but risked scaring off new investment. Mexican consumers, who had enjoyed affordable Chinese EVs, now faced higher prices and fewer choices. In the US and Canada, the dream of budget-friendly Chinese EVs remained out of reach, keeping prices high. The move protected jobs, but could slow EV adoption, as affordability remains a barrier. The new reality was a trade-off between industry security and consumer choice. The numbers tell the story of Mexico's tariff pivot. Between 2018 and 2024, Mexico's imports of Chinese auto parts soared by 93.5%, embedding Chinese content in North American supply chains. US imports of Mexican auto parts grew by nearly 50%, confirming fears of tariff circumvention. By 2024, Chinese brands captured nearly 10% of Mexico's new car market, with BYD leading EV sales. Mexico's EV output grew 30-fold since 2020, with 206,900 EVs produced in 2024, 80% exported to the US. This heavy reliance on the US made Mexico's auto sector vulnerable to American trade policy. Chinese investment in Mexico reached $3.77 billion in 2023, focused on greenfield manufacturing. The new 50% tariff and loss of incentives were calculated moves to protect Mexico's industry and its vital US trade relationship. The pivot sacrificed some Chinese investment to secure long-term stability. Mexico's bold trade move has redrawn the map for North American EVs. Chinese automakers now face steep tariffs across the continent, forcing them to reconsider their strategies. They may shift focus to other regions or attempt to localize supply chains in Mexico, a costly, years-long process. The 2026 USMCA review will test the new trade alignment, with the US and Canada likely pushing for stricter rules of origin. Mexico's pivot gives it leverage in negotiations, having shown it can address its partners' concerns. The outcome will shape the auto industry for the next decade. For workers, the united tariff front offers protection, but less competition could keep EV prices high. Mexico must balance attracting investment with nurturing its own industry. The saga is a lesson in global trade's shifting dynamics. Middle powers like Mexico are now strategic actors. The future of North American EVs will be shaped by innovation, trade policy, and the new realities of global competition.